Hey guys, welcome to BP, the Bible Perspective, as we talk about the rapture in Matthew 24 and the book of Revelation side by side. Now, before we continue, please like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. This is video 54 of our in-depth study of eschatology, the study of end times, with a focus on the rapture. We started this in-depth series with me, making my case for a pre-tribulation rapture. And it evolved into the in-depth study. In other words, what I wanted to do was to go in-depth, study the Old Testament scriptures, the New Testament scriptures, the prophecies on eschatology or end times. Oftentimes we make mention of the verses. We say, well, the Old Testament prophecy says such and such. We are actually looking at the verses themselves and studying. So in doing that, I am also attempting to make my case for a pre-trib rapture. Now, what do I mean by pre-trib rapture? For those that may not be familiar with the terminology or even the teaching, and believe it or not everyone always understands our lingo. So it's prudent for us to just briefly define the terms. When we talk about the rapture, and it is a highly debated subject within Christianity. It centers around the tribulation or the Great Tribulation period, which is a 7-year period of time in which God will judge the ungodly world. That's the tribulation period. Now, the rapture of the church is different than the second coming of Christ. The second coming is Jesus literally coming back physically to the earth to take over the kingdom. He will first, again, execute judgment, and then he will set up his earthly kingdom. We will get into that a little in this study. Now, the rapture, on the other hand, is Jesus removing his church from the earth. Where the debate comes in is, when will the rapture happen? Not so much as the fact that it will happen. There are some people that don't believe in the rapture of the church. I think they do so ignorantly or willful ignorance because they ignore certain key verses, such as 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. But pretty much most people will agree that the rapture will happen. Some people will say that the rapture and the second coming are the same event. But as far as our argument is concerned, our debate is concerned, is that it centers around when it will happen. So some believe that the rapture will happen before the tribulation period began. I hold to that view and thus been making my case. There are others that believe that the rapture will happen in the middle of the tribulation period. Excuse me. And then there are those who believe that the rapture will happen at the end of the tribulation period. Now, I always say this, that there is not a single verse that plainly states when the rapture will happen, pre, mid, or post-tribulation. So for that reason, let's agree to disagree at the least. Do so in the love of Christ. You'll be surprised how belligerent some people can get because you disagree or hold to the position. Now, I've been making my case because I've been showing what is involved in these prophecies of eschatology. And so, like I say, this is video 54. And so we're going to keep going. I've also included the study of the book of Revelation alongside with Matthew 24. The reason being is they are similar in their layout. Jesus both is giving the revelation, one before his death and the other one to the Apostle John, what is also considered the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelations. And so he lays out sort of a synopsis, you could say, of the end times. We've been studying them side by side. So right now where we are is at the second coming as Jesus comes back to earth and then he sets up his earthly kingdom. We're going to get more into that in this video. In video 53, we did a comparison of the three gospels and how they are, recorded from the different apostles or the different writers, okay? So I want to get back to that and go into Matthew 25. Really, Matthew 24 and Matthew 25 should be one chapter. Um, chapter headings and verses are not inspired. They are not, and sometimes they're placed in the oddest places. And the problem is that instinctively we break up to thought. So, for example, to go from verse 1 to verse 2, instinctively we could stop and kind of break up to thought when we should always read any of the books of the Bible as a continual narrative. Okay, so what's important to understand when we talk about then the rapture or the end times, what is the main theme of the end time? Well, you see, as we've been studying, you have Israel and then the prophecies concerning God's plan and purpose for Israel. That's the bulk of the prophecies. Within that, we also see the second coming of Jesus and then what he will do when he comes. And then we see, as from a New Testament perspective, the church, the body of Jesus, and where it fits into all of the prophetic prophecies. And we've been studying that. Now, at some point, I will circle back around and then do another look at the rapture, because now I would have talked about kind of everything that's been going on with both the Old Testament prophecies, and especially where Israel is concerned. And you need to understand that as we get back to Matthew 24 and then Matthew 25, because again, we studied, I believe it's in part 51, 52, somewhere around that area, the actual second return. I'll get into a little of that too as the prophecies kind of intersect. So let's get into let me show you this picture before I do, because this is a prophetic picture here. Now the reason I'm showing you this image because we go all the way back to Daniel chapter 2, and this is an artist's rendition of the image that the vision that God had given Nebuchadnezzar. I think it's in the first or second year of his reign. But anyway, it is this when he gave this dream, and he could not even tell his magicians what the dream was. So he told them, "Tell me the dream, and then you can tell me the interpretation." They basically said, "Oh, king, no one. That's impossible for anyone to do. If you tell us the dream, we'll tell you the interpretation. He says, no, 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 no. I want you to be able to tell me the dream, besides the fact it's gone for me. I don't remember it. But if you can tell me the dream, then I know you can give me the interpretation. Now, that this is, by the way, when you think of all the prophecies, prophets today, and people who's claiming to hear from God, yeah, this is a good way to be put on the spot. And you also got to remember, too, that kings had ultimate power. In other words, they literally can have you killed. And so when the magician failed to give him the interpretations, he ordered all of their execution, which included the newly deported Daniel and his um, friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel said, hey, I could give you the interpretation. And what he gave him was this image, this human form, this giant human form. And then he said, this is the interpretation, that the human form represents man's time on earth. Okay, I'm doing a little paraphrasing here, but man's time on earth. And it's represented 5 world dominating kingdoms from the time of Nebuchadnezzar until the second coming of Jesus. Now, this is important in terms of prophecy. We see this prophecy in Daniel, and especially, and then really, the book of Daniel, from chapter 7 through 12, is really an interpretation, an explanation of this image. And he just different ways. He gives the interpretation of this dream here. So they represent 5 world dominating kingdoms. From our perspective, 4 of those kingdoms have come and gone. Babylon, which was the head of gold, the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, which was the chest and arms of silver, and then the Grecian kingdom, which was the belly and thighs, and then the legs of iron, which was the Roman kingdom. So there's one kingdom left to arise in the earth, and that is the kingdom of the feet of the iron and the clay. As you can see right here, they say it's the restored Roman kingdom, but the Bible does not identify that kingdom as the restored Rome. Some people just they kind of make that's their interpretation. Anyway, it is yet to rise, but we do know that with the feet of iron of iron and clay, and then also you see the 10 toes representing 10 nations. Daniel said, in the days of this kingdom, Jesus will set up a kingdom that would never end, which is represented by the rock here. That the rock comes made without hands, and it crushes the image. It strikes the image at its feet. Now, striking the image at its feet is a timeline, because the rock could have struck the image anywhere and pulverized it. But Daniel said it struck the image at the feet and pulverized the entire image. And the reason why is because he said, in the days of this kingdom, which is yet to rise, even from our perspective, our day, we haven't seen this kingdom yet. In the days of those kings, then the Lord of Lords will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. Okay. Now, at that point, that's the second coming of Jesus. And what you see from that time forward is no longer man or sinful man dominating the world in the evil way, in an ungodly way. Okay? So let's go to our scriptures then. And, oh, excuse me. What I want to do, because I'm going to come back to Matthew 24 and then go into Matthew 25. And let me do this, though, for sure. Let me do this. Let me go to Revelation chapter 19. because remember, we're kind of, in a sense, tracking them side by side. All right, so we studied this. And when I wanted, in verse 11, when he said, then I saw heaven open, and there was a white horse. Its rider is called Faithful and True, and he judges to make war in righteousness. His eyes were like a fiery flame, and many crowns were on his head. He had a name written that no one knows except himself. He wore a robe stained with blood, and his name is the Word of God. The armies that were in heaven followed him on white horses, wearing pure white linen. The sharp sword came out of his mouth so that he might strike the nations with it, and he will shepherd them with an iron scepter. And so here we see the kind of spectacular return of Jesus, but we also see what he will do when he comes. Okay? And again, this is important. What he will do when he comes. Now, I'm not I get into this theology that I'm going to describe in another sets of videos. I don't deal with it here. But there's another view of eschatology that is called, and actually kind of, there are three different names for it. There's what's called post-millennialism, all-millennialism, and then preterism. Now, again, I'm not going to deal with these three. They are an entirely different category for the reason that how they interpret Scripture. So in part, they interpret Scripture allegorical, and thus they come up with some weird conclusions. So for example, post-millennialism believe that most of the stuff came to pass already, and that the church is going to conquer the world and win the world, and then when Jesus comes, he's coming back to a welcoming world. Okay, so that's post-millennialism. But as you can see here, Jesus comes back with a sword. Then all millennium believe that the scriptures are, again, allegorical, and they believe most of the these prophecies have already happened, which means you have to discount everything that's being said. Preterism, it's pretty much the same, that everything has already happened. Again, I think they're kind of some weird doctrines, but I deal with them separately. But you can, again, if you believe in postmillennium, and a lot of people do, or any of those three, then you kind of have to explain this. If you believe that everything happened by AD 70, and that we're going to win the world, that the church themselves is going to win the world. By the way, if they believe that the church is winning the world, that the church is doing a horrible job at it, especially post-millennial people. But again, I get into why I would say that, because a lot of the post-millennial people seem to be white Christian nationalists. Okay, but I do digress. So again, he says that a sharp sword comes from his mouth, and he strikes the nations with it. He will shepherd them with a rod of iron. So this is the millennial reign. He's on his way. This is what's going to happen when he gets there. But notice also what he says. He also tramples the winepress of the fierce anger of God Almighty. And his name is written on his robe and on his thigh, King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. Then I saw an angel standing on the sun, and he cried with a loud voice, saying to all the birds flying overhead, come gather together to the great supper of God, so that you may eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of commanders, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses, and of their riders, and the flesh of everyone, both free and slave, small and great. And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to wage war against the rider on the horse and against his army. The beast was taken prisoner, along with him the false prophet, who had performed signs and wonders in his presence, and he deceived those who had the mark of the beast, and those who worship the beast with these signs. Both of them were thrown alive into the lake of fire, fire that burns with sulfur. And then he says the rest were killed with the sword that came from the mouth of the rider on the horse, and the birds were filled with his flesh. Now we actually compared this also with um, um, Ezekiel, that gave us the same prophecy, okay, about God providing a great supper for the kings of the earth, okay, and we're going to get, and again, we're going to highlight some of the verses where he gathers the armies, and that we see here the beast. Now, of course, we studied Revelations from chapter 1 all the way up to verse 19. I mean, chapter 19, and so where we are right now is this is what happens when he comes. He comes with what? Judgment. Okay. He says the rest were killed with the sword that came from his mouth on the riders, and all of the birds were filled with their flesh. Now, let me read this first part of chapter 20. And then I'll come back to this at another time. But he says, Then I saw the angel coming down from heaven with the key to the abyss and a great chain in his hand. And he seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he threw him into the abyss, closed it, and put a seal on it, so that he would no longer deceive the nations until the 1,000 years were complete. But after that, he must be released for a short time. Now, this is what's referred to as the millennial reign of Jesus. And the millennial reign simply means 1,000. I think it's the Greek word, but it means 1,000 years. And that's, of course, millennial. Now, some people will say that this is an allegory, and they say for different reasons, but some people would think that it doesn't really specify a certain particular time. I do believe it is 1,000 years. And the reason why I say that is because look at the language. He says that Satan was bound for 1,000 years, and then after the 1,000 years was complete, he will be released. So, I think when you have such specific details, then I don't know. I would believe that it is 1,000. Now, by the way, we'll come back. Excuse me. Ooh. If we look down further in chapter 20, he says right here, verse 4, where I'm going to pick up the last sentence here. He says, they came to life and reigned with the Messiah for 1,000 years. And then he says, but the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years was complete. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shared in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, and they should be priests of God and the Messiah, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. And then it says that when the 1,000 years are complete, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out and deceive the nations. Now, I'll come back to that because that is one of the most astounding statements there. But so we see this term 1,000 years mentioned. Let me go back to Joel because I'm going to show you a couple of verses that gives us insight into the millennial reign of Jesus. Now, let me also tell you why I think what is the purpose of the millennial reign of Jesus. And there's few things that's going on in the millennial reign of Jesus here. What do I want? Do I want Joel chapter 3? Okay. So in Joel chapter 3, now let me kind of go back because remember in my image, let me come out of this for a moment. Let's kind of go back to this image here. And this is why I think you have 1,000 years, or the purpose for the 1,000-year reign. So remember this image here, which this prophecy has already come to pass. Like, from our perspective, 5 of these world dominating kingdoms, that's the common denominator here. You have had other mighty kingdoms, for example, the Assyrian Empire, the Egyptian Empire, were mighty kingdoms, but they didn't dominate the world. These kingdoms will rule, or they have ruled, the entire world. That's the common denominator. But also, it represents a time of man, sinful man, ungodly man, okay, which will end with Jesus, okay. So, sorry, post-millennialists, but Jesus brings to an end the ungodly world and the ungodly rule of man. So the 1,000 years is when you have the second coming. Well, first he purges the earth of these evil kingdoms, and then he will rule. And by the way, during this time, you still will have the curse, the result of sin that Adam brought. In other words, we have an ultimate promise of God making a new heavens and a new earth. Okay, which again we'll get to later. So what's happening when Jesus comes back the second time? This is not a new heavens and the new earth, but it is Jesus reigning, in which I believe under this still contaminated world. In other words, sin will be rolled back, as we read. Satan will be bound, so Satan will not incite the world to sin. So the reason why you have sin, and as he's called the ruler of the world, is because he incites man to sin. He incites man to rebel. Okay? So when Jesus comes back, he physically comes back, then there are several things that he executes. One, as we said, the purging of the evil reign of man, the reign of Satan. In other words, he brings his sword of judgment against the evil world, as we saw in the book of Revelations, where he puts Satan kind of in prison for 1,000 years. And during that 1,000 years, there is no one being incited to sin, which kind of tells us, which is interesting. It tells us why the world is the way it is today. Okay. So if I wanted to just for a moment get into a speculation, and let's just say if Jesus did not come back, but yet bound Satan. In other words, he didn't come back, but he bound Satan. So you would not have Satan inciting the world to sin. You would still have sin, but you wouldn't have Satan inciting the world to sin. Okay? And by the way, it's just a thought too. Now, just like we have these kind of thoughts about what would have happened if Adam did not sin, okay? Well, we don't know because it's really not on the table, but it's just a thought. So here's what happens. Jesus comes back, and then he evicts sin. He evicts sinful man from the earth. And in a sense, that's where we are right now. So then he takes over the earth. And let me show you a couple of verses again about that. So in Joel chapter 3, so he says, Yes, in those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations and take them to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Now, I want you to keep this in mind because we're going to get into, uh, when we get into Matthew 24 and 25, okay? So he says, and I will enter into judgment with them there because of my people, my inheritance, Israel. The nations have scattered the Israelites into foreign countries and divided up my land, right? So we kind of, even to this day, Israel do not possess all the land. The Israelites do not possess all the land. They do not dwell in safety, as we see, especially with current news, okay? At the time of this recording right here, you have all-out attacks on Israel, okay? But notice he says, my people Israel will inherit the land. Now again, it's important to understand the prophecies as God gave them. And remember I said one of the purposes Israel. Most of the Old Testament prophecies are about Israel. For that matter, even I would say most of the New Testament prophecies about God's plan and purpose about Israel. Okay, people try to interject the church in Israel as if they're one. They're not. So in this time here, so let me say this. So you have Jesus' return, you have a 1,000-year reign, you have the judgment, and then you have what is called the eternal age. God creates a new heaven and earth. You see the city, the New Jerusalem. There will be no more sin, no more wickedness, no more bad. Okay. So that's kind of the sequence of events. Where we are in our study is Jesus is now coming back. So what is he going to do when he comes back? So the first thing he says, I will gather all the nations to Jehoshaphat and enter into judgment with them there because of my people, my inheritance Israel. The nations have scattered the Israelites into foreign countries and divided up my land. They cast lots for my people and bartered a boy for a prostitute and sold a girl for wine to drink. So, oh, don't want to read all this. Well, okay, I'll go back and read this. It says, so also, Tyre and Sidon and all the territory of Philistia, uh, Philistia, what are you to me? Are you paying me back or trying to get even with me? I will quickly bring retribution upon your heads. For you took my silver and gold and carried my finest treasures to your temple. You sold the people of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks to remove them far from their own territory. Look, I'm about to rouse them up from the place where you sold them and bring retribution upon your head. I will sell your sons and daughters into the hands of the people of Judah, and they will sell them to the Sabeans, to a distant land. For the Lord has spoken. Proclaim this among the nations. Prepare for holy war. Rouse the warriors. Let all the men of war advance and attack. Beat your plows. Now this I wanted to also read. Beat your plows into swords. And your pruning knives into spears, that even the weaklings say, I am a warrior. Come quickly, all you surrounding nations, gather yourselves, bring down your warriors there, Lord. Let the nations be roused and come to the valley of Jehoshaphat, for I will sit down to judge all the surrounding nations. Swing the sickle, because the harvest is ripe. Come and trample the grapes, because the winepress is full and the wine vats overflow, because the wickedness of the nation is great. So this is again a picture of when Jesus comes in terms of judgment. We also saw this same language in the book of Revelations. You have to go back, well, two things. You have to go back in our studies, but you also can go back and just read in the book of Revelations chapters 6 through 16, and you see this language used about when God comes to judge in wrath, okay, the wickedness of man. He says, multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. The sun and the moon, when the moon will grow dark, and the stars will cease shining. The Lord will war from Zion and raise his voice from Jerusalem. Heaven and earth will shake, but the Lord will be a refuge for his people and a stronghold for Israel. All right, now let me also do this. Let me go to, well, look at verse 17. Then you will know that I am Yahweh, your God, who dwells in Zion, my holy mountain. Jerusalem will be holy, and foreigners will never overrun it again. In that day, the mountain will drip with sweet wine, and the hills will flow with milk. All the streams of Judah will flow with water, and a spring will issue from the Lord's house, watering the valley of Cassius. And then Egypt will become Egypt will become desolate, Edom a desert wasteland because of the violence done to the people of Judah, and whose land they shed innocent blood. But Judah will be inhabited forever, and Jerusalem from generation to generation. I will pardon their blood guilt, which I have pardoned, for the Lord dwells in Zion. So we see from the tribulation period, okay, we put this together from the tribulation period, the judgment, including Israel, and then the Lord comes and fights for Israel, restores them, and then blesses their land. Okay, he will reign from Israel. Let's take a look and see. Let's go to, okay, let's go to Zechariah chapter 14. Okay, I want to have this. I want you to have this in your mind when we get back into Matthew 24 and 25, so you can have it all together. Okay, so this is that we've studied this before. He says, "A day of the Lord is coming, when your plunder will be divided in your presence. And I will gather all nations against Jerusalem for battle." So we see the same thing. I will gather all nations in Jerusalem for battle. The city will be captured, the houses looted, the women raped, half the city will go into exile, but the rest of the people will not be removed from the city. The Lord will go out and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east. The Mount of Olives will be split in half from east to west, forming a huge valley, so that half of the mountain will be moved to the north and half to the south. You will flee by my mountain valley, for the valley of the mountains will extend to Azal, and you will flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah the king. Then the Lord my God will come, and all of his holy ones, excuse me, with him. Now, if you remember in Revelation 19, what happens? When you see the heavens open and the rider comes out on his horse, which is Jesus, the King of Kings. And notice he says, the holy ones with him. And that's kind of an always interesting statement. Who are the holy ones that he is referring to? Who are in heaven riding out on horses. I'll come back to that when I get back to pleading my case for the pre-tribulation rapture. Because the holy ones are with him when he comes. They're not on earth when he comes. But I digress a little bit. Verse 6, on that day there will be no light. The sunlight and the moonlight will diminish. It will be a day known only to Yahweh, without day or night, and there will be light at evening. On that day, living waters will flow out of Jerusalem. Now, remember we read this in Joel just now. half of it towards the eastern sea and the other half towards the western sea, in the summer and the winter alike. On that day, Yahweh will become king over all the earth. Now, again, so what happens when Jesus comes? He will become king over all the earth, but will rule from Jerusalem. Yahweh alone and his name alone. All the land from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem, would be changed into a plain. But Jerusalem would be raised up and remain on its site from the Benjamin gates to the place of the first gates, to the corner gates, to the Tower of Hanel, to the Royal Rhine Press. Okay, so I don't know, I don't have a reference to that because I've never been to Israel. So if you've been to Israel, you might have some kind of image or picture in your mind how that's going to look. Verse 11, people will live there, and never again will there be a curse of complete destruction. And so notice that term curse. Now, remember I said when Jesus comes, he removes the curse. One of the sources of the curse is Satan inciting the people. He's bound for 1,000 years, right? He's not inciting the people. And thus, the curse that comes as a result of sin is rolled back. Okay? So he says, so people will live there, and never again will there be a curse of complete destruction. So Jerusalem will dwell in security. Again, this is why we know that this hasn't happened. Okay? We know that right now, what you see going on in Jerusalem with the people going back to the land is not a fulfillment of prophecy. Because notice he said right here, Jerusalem will dwell in security. They don't dwell in security right now. Verse 12 says, this will be the plague the Lord strikes all the people with who have warred against Jerusalem. Now remember, he gathers all the people. We also know that the people that are gathered will be the beast, and his armies will gather together to make war against the king, Jesus. He says this will be the plague the Lord strikes all the people with who have warred against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they stand on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot on their mouth. On that day, a great panic from the Lord will be among them, so each will see the hand of another, and the hand of the one will rise against the other. Judah will also fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations will be collected: gold, silver, clothing, great abundance. The same plague as the previous one will strike the horses, mules, camels, donkeys, and all the animals that are in those camps. Then all the survivors from the nations. Now notice this term here. Then all of the survivors. Now again, I want you to keep this in mind as we get into, again, Matthew 24 and 25. Then all of the survivors from the nations that come against Jerusalem will go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the festivals of booths. Now remember, so this is the now millennial reign. He says, verse 17, should any of the family of the earth not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts will not, rain will not fall on them. And if the people of Egypt will not go up and enter and go up there and enter, then rain will not fall on them. This will be the plague that the Lord inflicts on the nations who do not go up to celebrate the festival of booths. This will be the punishment of Egypt and all the nations that do not and go up and celebrate the festival of booths on that day. All right. Now I want to go to Matthew 24, and I'm going to start it, and then we'll probably get into it in the next study. So remember, this is the end time scenario that Jesus is explaining to the disciples that asked him. I'm going to skip down to verse 15, and then you will see we're going to put all the verses that we have studied together. I mean, kind of string them together now. Verse 15 says, "So when you see the abomination that causes desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. A man on his housetop must not come down to get his things out of his house. And a man in the field must not go back to get his clothes. Woe to the pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. Pray your escape may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath." Excuse me. "For at that time there would be great tribulation, the kind that hasn't taken place from the beginning of the world until now, and never will again. Unless those days were limited, no one would survive, but those days will be limited because of the elect." So you look at in Zechariah when he gathered all the nations, but before then, this is the tribulation period here that he's talking about. Right? So if anyone tells you, look, the Messiah, here's the Messiah over there, do not believe it. False messiahs, false prophets will arise and perform great signs, and the one is to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Take note, I have told you in advance. So if they tell you, look, he is in the wilderness, don't go out. Look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes as far as the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man will be. Where the carcass is, there will be vultures gathered. Kind of interesting. He mentions kind of twice about being aware of false messiahs. We have them. It seems like every generation, we're going to have people that's going to rise up and say, "Guess what? I'm either the Messiah, or I know when Jesus is going to come. Hey, let's meet someplace, and we're going to wait and gather for Jesus to come." Every generation. Every generation. I think we're due for some crackpot to show up now. Verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days. So now we went through the great tribulation period, that 7-year tribulation period. So now here's the return of Jesus. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun would be darkened, and the moon would not shed its light, the stars would fall from the sky, and the celestial powers would be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. And then all of the people of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He will send out his angels with a loud trumpet, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now we said this is not the rapture here. And the reason why this is not the rapture is because here is the difference. In the rapture of the church, Jesus comes personally for his people. And if you notice here, he says he will send his angels out to gather his elect. So that's why we know this is not talking about the rapture. So the elect here is referring to Israel. He's been talking about Israel since verse 15 when he says, when you see the abomination that causes desolation, spoken by Daniel. Well, this prophecy was in Daniel chapter 9 when he said the decree, 70 weeks of decree on your people, meaning the Jews, on your city, Jerusalem, and on the temple. That's what that prophecy is about. That's the prophecy that he is reciting here. So the elect here is not the church or Christians. It is the nation of Israel, the people of Israel. And notice he said he will send his angels to gather them. The promise Jesus told his church, his body, is that he himself will come for the body. Okay, so verse 32 says, "Now learn this parable from the fig tree. And as soon as its branches become tender and sprout leaves, you know that summer is near. And in the same way, when you see these things, recognize that he is near at the door. I assure you, this generation will certainly not pass until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away." Now, again, there are people who have erroneously interpreted the fig tree as Israel, right? And erroneously come up with this idea that a generation is 40 years. I've yet to see any scriptures to back up either claim. The fact that he says the fig tree here did not say that when, in fact, even in the context here, it does not speak of Israel becoming a nation again. And some people really believe that. The fig tree represents a sign of the time. In other words, when you know it's winter because the trees is bare, no leaves. You know spring is approaching because they start forming leaves. You know summer's leaves because those leaves are fully formed and the fruit is appearing. That's what he's saying right here. When you see the fig tree, but then he says, when you see this, you know that this generation, what? All the things that he spoke about. When you see all these things, he said, that's the generation. And by the way, a generation that is not 40 years, a generation is just except it is a group of people. For example, I'm a generation, my children are a generation, my grandchildren are a generation. So there's 3 generations represented there. My great grandchildren or child at this point is a generation. So that's 4 generations. I have 4 generations right now because both my parents and my grandparents are dead. If my mother was alive, that would be 5 generations. Okay, so that's the idea of a generation that he is referring to. Um, so then that's when the second coming appears. Now he comes down to verse 36. He says, "Now concerning the day or the hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, except the Father only." All right. Now, he's going to give us signs of the when you can know when Jesus coming is near. He says, as the days of Noah were, so the coming of the Son of Man will be. For in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah boarded the ark, and they didn't know until the flood came and swept them all away. So is the way the coming of the Son of Man will be. Now, I want to talk about this, the days of Noah, because here he says eating and drinking, but it was a lot more sinful when you go back and you read the days of the coming of Noah. And the reason why this is important, because again, you have people today, like evangelicals, okay, and evangelicals in the 50s, I think, you can go back as far as the 50s, that there were evangelical pastors preaching that we were in the days of Noah. And they began to preach the judgment of America, okay, that America was doomed. Now, if you kind of go back in the 50s, the reason why they begin to say that is because of rock and roll and different things like that, and how people begin to express themselves, and you could even say, in some ways, sinful. But based upon that, and here is the kind of, I'm going to say, delusion. Like if you lived in the 50s and you said, oh my God, things are so bad. I mean, because here was the kind of a fictional life. That the 50s, and you go back to the 40s, that everything was so pure. No, everything was presented and it was presented that way as pure. Meaning this, everybody, when you look at the fictional TV shows such as Ozzie and Harriet, Father Knows Best, The Brady Bunch, these family shows where everybody lived together, everybody got along, everybody apologized at the end, and they just said, "Gosh darn, that was a fantasy." People went to church. Now you didn't see this on the television shows, But people went to church, right? But not everybody went to church. And what they don't tell you about those times were the racists, okay? So while they presented are the inherit, right? You don't see black people in those shows. But the worst reality was that the incredible racism. And the evangelicals never said that was the sin. Never mentioned that at all, as that God was very upset on how Christians were treating their fellow Christians of color, how America, in other words, that was never a sin. So when they say the days of Noah, that certainly wasn't a sin. But worse, the problem is that there was this kind of imaginary life. You still had violence. You had everything that's going on today. You had back then. People forget when they espouse these imaginary times. What do you think was going on in the age of organized crime, Al Capone and all of them? Debauchery was going on just as much, and openly. But they wasn't. So they wasn't saying that God was going to judge America in the 20s and the 30s, doing those organized crime times. And then also, so this idea that America was pure, it was never pure. It's the same as today. What you see on TV, what is presented in the media, that was the image that people said, well, we're getting away from. You didn't have you didn't have the gay parade. They were in the closet, and there were a lot of them in the closet. You had still alcohol, drunkenism. You go to church on Sunday, but Saturday night you was tearing up the town. And we don't want to get into the abuse. We don't get into, the incest, the hidden sins. So when people say, that America is now, oh man, since the 60s. And the main reason why they said that is simply this. People start doing things more openly. So the only thing that changed is that it's not that people started doing these sins. They just started doing them openly. And then evangelicals said, oh my, well, God's going to judge America. One preacher even said that if God doesn't judge America, he's going to have to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah. You had that kind of arrogance that was being preached right there. At the same time, the same preacher never said anything, as I said, about the racism, the horrific conditions of Jim Crow. That wasn't enough sin that was going to bring judgment. But, oh Lord, people were in hot pans and bikinis were. All right, we're going to pick up with this. Obviously, we're going to continue on with this. And we'll come back to this idea of what is the comparison to the days of Noah? Because we're not there yet, but we'll talk about it. But don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. And I do mean that. All comments are welcome. And I will see you in part 55. All right.